Hello. I'm not sure I've mentioned this much over the last few months, but this channel has grown quite significantly since the start of the year. And it occurred to me that because that's the case, there are many of you that don't know a bit of the history of Lawrence Brown. And I thought today would be a good opportunity just to offer some refreshments, not drinks, just sort of refreshing people's memories or infiltrating those memories for the first time if you don't know these stories, about why I became interested in American themes. It isn't just because I moved here. There was a whole kind of precursor to all of that I'm going to delve into here today. Firstly, if you are new to my channel, welcome. Who am I? I'm Lawrence Brown, that's already been stated. But where did I come from? I was from a town called Grimsby. This is where I grew up. I say grew up, you've seen these videos. I, spent my childhood years there and my teen years, and it was quite a far cry from what you imagine in the United States. What was the United States to me back then? Well, mostly it was what I was fed in films. I think this is true of any English person who has any interest in America at all. They're mostly brought to that fascination by the movies because we're absolutely inundated with Hollywood. For me, it was 1980s movies, classic 1980s movies like Indiana Jones films or Back to the Future or Police Academy 4. I thought I learned quite a lot from these films about how America is, that there are palm trees everywhere, that the weather is always beautiful and sunny. I think I got this sort of idealized version of what America is through watching those films as a kid. Just as anybody who watches any kind of royal wedding or Jane Austen drama would get the false impression of what England is. And so that's just how it was. But it built up in me this sense of adventure, this enormity surrounding the United States, to the extent that instead of portraying James Bond on the playground, I portrayed Indiana Jones. But I remember at the time, as I was kind of sort of starstruck by these American ideas, that my dad, who has kind of an encyclopedic knowledge of sort of geography and history, was really interested in all of the 50 states of America and their capitals and can recite them to this very day, as can I, because I learned from him, right? And I didn't know that this would come in useful later down the road. I just thought, oh, this is useless trivia to have. But I went on to make a video in which I outlined my ability to name all of the states and capitals. And that video subsequently made about $92 through Google AdSense. So Dad, we actually paid for most of the encyclopedia through that. And I think it was handy to have that voice, to have my dad's voice feed me bits of knowledge and bits of excitement around this notion of America. And bear in mind, this notion then, just as now, sort of transcends the idea of politics and things like that. Because I am aware, of course, that political things are happening and they're very charged. But the things that I'm talking about, things like landscape, geography, are things that sort of go underneath that political radar in many ways. And those are the things that I kind of always had a fascination with and still do. And that's why, to some extent, my channel is about appreciating those things in the United States. But because, that all came to me at a young age, I think there was a pivotal moment for me when I was young. I was about 8 years old, and it had been revealed to me by my family that we were going to visit Florida, Orlando specifically. And when I told people at school, really casually, I'm going to Florida this year, they couldn't believe it. Their response was along the lines of, "You're going to America? Wow, you're like a megastar." And I've just made that last part up. And we're really jealous, basically, because I think people back then, I'm not sure it's such a big thing now just because of how global we've become, but in the late 80s, early 90s, me and my friends perceived America to be this sort of magic kingdom, for want of a better phrase. And, bear in mind, obviously, when you're that age, you're busy boasting about the fact that your dad has £1 million in the bank when you have no idea how impoverished he is. And what this visit to Florida did was it took both my interest in those American films and in sort of America in general and sort of put them into one. And when I say films in this regard, think of Universal Studios, think of Disney World, think of all of that. For me, it was unbelievable to see parts of the set where Roger Rabbit and Judge Doom and Eddie Valiant duked it out. And I feel like I was the first British person to see this, apart from Bob Hoskins, obviously. And that trip to Florida was absolutely amazing. I came away from it with not just the sights and sounds in my ears and eyes, the other way around, but also the smell of what I thought America was. And I think it was just the smell of International Drive. This smell stayed with me actually to this very day. If I smell the smell that I'm thinking of now, I think of the Holiday Inn at International Drive, and that's beautiful. When we got back to Britain after that holiday, all I could think was, I really want to live there. Not Disney World, that would be stupid, but just the United States. But I had my first taste of America, and I heard real American accents for the first time and saw things you wouldn't believe, like Mickey Mouse going to the restroom. And all of this only fueled a growing obsession I had with the United States. And this obsession would continue into secondary school until people just thought, I'm not sure he's perfectly normal, but we'll admit him anyway and see how it goes. And after they did that, in the first few weeks of being there, I took out a book. This book was called America, An Aerial View. I was obsessed with not only knowing all of the states and their capitals, but finding out sort of visual facts about them and just getting to know the terrain from afar. You bear in mind, this is before Flight Simulator, or at least the good version we have now. That was the only real way that I could sort of educate myself. And I didn't just want to know about Florida or New York or California, the big three. I wanted to know it all. I wanted to know about Arkansas. What did that look like from the air? I knew that instinctively there were things people weren't telling me about America. There were weird tricks that the government didn't want you to know. So I'm just referring to ads from the 21st century. Don't take away from this video that all British people are super fascinated by world and specifically American geography. This is not the case. This was the case with me and me alone. Not me alone, I'm sure there were others. And I flipped through it so often as a kid that when I came back to it decades later, I still remembered all of the pictures that were assigned to each state, to the extent that when I visited Milwaukee in the year 2017, I remembered the Horticultural Museum because it's photographed in the book. When you've grown up with this image of a building from above and then you see it from both ground level and inside, it sort of shatters every illusion you had about the Horticultural Museum of Milwaukee. Like I said, I did borrow this book from my school library when I was 12, but I didn't know then just how useful it would come in to my eventual career here on YouTube, but the late fees were definitely worth it. Then I entered a period of life known as my adolescence. The American thing kind of got put on the back burner. I was more focused, I suppose, on my studies, Mom, than anything else, but mostly other things. I was learning about Shakespeare, World War II, and how to be rubbish at cricket. And I just didn't have time for sort of non-English things, I suppose, at school and on the playground. And at that time, you're in that period of life where you're keeping your cards close to your chest. I think part of me was probably a little embarrassed at having this nerdy knowledge of another country when all of the other boys on the playground were talking about Pamela Anderson, who ironically is she Canadian or is she American? Back then it was all the same. Calls to mind my university days, and this is the time period when I had a reignition of my fascination for America. And it's not because I studied here in America, I studied at Lancaster in England, but that that particular university had a program that welcomed a lot of American students, and I worked with a number of them in the theatre. It was sort of enlightening to hear both their take on England, right, and all of the things about England that were somehow unique. You don't have mushy peas in America. I came to find later on you don't have mushy peas anywhere but Britain. One thing that came with this exposure to American students is I accidentally allowed some of them to date me. In doing so, I've had multiple girlfriends that were American, 2 in total, and in many ways was a kind of an inroad to some of the more nuanced knowledge and details and information about the United States. And I found myself taking on board a lot of this information that would come in handy later on for both my life in America and for this channel. It was little details, but it was also the way they spoke and things they said that were kind of, you know, giving me clues to dialectal features that you might not hear in the movies. I remember, you know, my ex had spent a lot of time in Massachusetts and used the phrase wicked good. From that moment on, just assumed all Americans did it. And then a couple of years later at university, I met my now wife, who is from the Midwest. But something that was quite nerve-wracking was meeting her parents for the first time. It was in a cafe in London, and one of the first things that was said to me over breakfast from my father-in-law was, "I understand you have a thing for American girls." And I just responded with, "Yep, I'm trying to get to all 50 states. And the fact that he laughed at that was enough to convince me that maybe she's the one, and maybe I'm the one for her. Once it became clear that Tara was my Wallace Simpson, that's a really bad example, but you get the gist, we decided, you know, maybe there's a possibility that we could live together in the same country. We just didn't know which country yet. We attempted to live together in England, but then, you know, the recession hit and we became casualties, not physically, just monetarily. And we then engineered a quite terrible plan to move to Indiana. And since we're on the subject of things that fueled my obsession prior to moving here, the visit that I made in 2007 to Indiana was an eye-opener in many ways because it showed me firsthand Midwestern winters, and how that didn't put me off moving here is beyond me to this day, but it didn't. And during that visit, I got to meet not just Tara's parents, but her extended family that I was marrying into. And let me tell you, this is a very sort of Midwestern / Southern, because there's parts of West Virginia, family. I didn't understand that then. I didn't understand the cultural nuances. I do though looking back, and that's fascinating. I think if I'd have known then what I know now, I would have contributed more to that dinner conversation than the name's Brown, Lawrence Brown. My alarm's going off, and I'm pressing dismiss, and it doesn't work. Oh, now it has. So that was how my American obsession that brought me to this country and to start this YouTube channel began. The wording of that sentence was awful. Can we have a rewrite for next time? Thanks for watching. Goodbye.